Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My talk this evening is a biographical talk on this lady astronomer, and she was known as the Honourable Mrs. Mary Ward. And you can see she was born in 1827 and died in 1869. And the title of the talk is Accidental Death of an Astronomer. So I'll keep the accidental bit right to the end, and we'll start off by discussing where she came from. So her father was the Reverend Henry King, and her mother was Harriet Lloyd. They were born in the last quarter of the 18th century. They married in 1821, and they lived in the Republic of Ireland, as we would call it now, right in the centre in County Offaly, a small town near Ferbain. Soon after marriage, the children started to appear, as was the case in the 19th century. A son, two daughters, and then Mary, the youngest child, which is the subject of my talk this evening. So not much is known about her childhood, and this is one of the few photographs we have of her. And as you can see on the table next to her is a stereoscope. So you put pictures in, and lo and behold, when you looked in the two eyepieces, you saw a three-dimensional picture. It must have been a real wonder of the age. From an early age, she was interested in science, and certainly one of the things that ladies were directed towards was botany and entomology, so flowers, plants and insects. So these were seen as suitable subjects for young ladies to study. She moved on from these subjects to astronomy, and in 1835 there was an apparition of Halley's Comet, and despite the fact that she was only 8 years old, she managed to set up a telescope and find Halley's Comet in the night sky of her own volition. Later on, there was a party at the vicarage, and she made an announcement that she'd managed to discover the comet on her own, much to the surprise of the adult guests of her parents. They must have been quite well-connected people, because they knew a chap called Sir James South, slightly eccentric character, but perhaps one of the foremost amateur astronomers of the early 19th century. And he recommended that she be given a microscope. Apparently it cost £48, which would have been really quite expensive in this time. And it was made by Ross of London. And it was said to be the finest microscope in the whole of Ireland at the time. And it just opened up a whole new world for her in the study of plants and insects. Moving on now to astronomy. Ferbain is only 14 or so miles from a town which is currently known as Burr, but was then called Parsonstown. And this is where the Earls of Ross lived. Mary and the third Earl of Ross, whose birth name was William Parsons, were in fact cousins. And it's from him that Mary learned her astronomy. Although his first passion was mechanical engineering, and he really liked to test himself, to build mechanisms, to make sure they worked in the way he thought they would, and then go on to produce a better mechanism next time round. And it's said that he built the biggest telescope in the world at the time, not necessarily because he was interested in astronomy, but just he wanted to test his engineering skills to the limit to produce a working instrument. It was 72 inches or 1.8 meters aperture, and 52.5 feet or 16 meters in focal length. And as you can see from the image here, it's essentially a Newtonian reflecting telescope. Mary was apparently one of the first to climb the ladder and then the gallery to look through the telescope when it came into use in the middle of February 1845. And she later told how she more than once stood in the bitter frost long after midnight, viewing the heavens through this instrument. As I've said, it came into use in 1845, and it's about this time that the Irish potato famine struck. Historians regard it as starting in 1845 and running through for a couple of years until 1847. So they just got the telescope built, and then there's a tremendous famine through the country. The Earl of Ross and his wife Mary, that I've also shown here, set about rebuilding work on the castle that they lived in, just to employ people, to give them work and to put money in their pockets. And it said that they employed over 500 people reconstructing the work. The famine they couldn't do much about, and after it was all over, 1 million people had died, 1 million more had emigrated, and it meant that the population of Ireland fell by around a quarter. However, there were better times ahead, and in 1848, the Earl of Ross became president of the Royal Society, and he made sure that Mary attended the dinner parties that he gave so that she could keep up to date with the astronomical and scientific chit-chat of the day, even if she couldn't do anything more formal. And on one occasion, when he was unable to answer, he replied, "My cousin Mary knows rather more about this than I do, and I recommend that you address her on this subject." So he was clearly one to allow Mary to fulfill her scientific interests. And it's also around this time that there were only 3 ladies who were able to receive the publications of the Royal Astronomical Society. And they were Queen Victoria, who was patron of the RAS, a lady, quite famous scientist, whose name was Mary Somerville, and she was at Oxford, and at the agitation of the Astronomer Royal for Ireland, our own Mary. She married, as we can see here, a chap called Henry William Crosbie Ward. So he was born at Castle Ward in County Down, and he went to rugby school and then the Royal Military College, Sandhurst. And this is his home, and it's rather an unusual building. It's almost as if they couldn't decide what style they want. And one elevation is in one style, and you go around the back of the building and it looks completely different. He was a captain in the army, and you can see there the wars that he fought in South Africa. And he married Mary in December 1854. Unfortunately, in Victorian times and through into the 20th century, there was very little control on fertility, and so you often see after marriage children appearing at almost yearly intervals. And as you can see, this family had 8 children. The marriage was somewhat one-sided, with Mary being left at home to raise the ever-increasing number of children, while her husband Henry went off to enjoy his active social life and other interests. And it's possible that he was actually unfaithful to his wife. So there's 8 children shown here. There is also believed to have been 2 miscarriages and a stillbirth. So we can only imagine the physical strain on Mary's body by more or less being a continual state of pregnancy. Her husband, up to 1881, was known as the Honourable, which is why Mary is also known as the Honourable. And then after that date, he was 5th Viscount Bangor. So obviously he sat in the House of Lords. So Mary set about using her science, probably to provide an income in addition to money provided by her husband. And she wrote 3 books, 3 scientific books. The first one, or the first 2, about using a microscope and about studying insects. But the 3rd book is perhaps the most interesting for us. It's called Telescope Teachings. It did have various titles through the years, first published in 1859. I'll just show a couple of quick slides on her work with the microscope. So this is an illustration from her first book, Sketches for the Microscope, and you can see here that Mary has produced not only an accurate representation of her microscope, but also some of the things that you can see through it. So she was obviously an extremely talented artist. Second book, which was on the study of insects, again you can see somewhat fanciful, but probably scientifically very accurate depiction of insects. So here's her astronomical book. It ran through at least 6 editions down to 1880. And as you can see here from the frontispiece of the book, a small refractor pointed out a bedroom window and either an ephemeris to tell you what's in the sky or a notebook for you to jot down what you could see through the telescope. So the first edition came out in 1859, and then I say that down to 1880 there were in fact 6 updated versions of the book. So the chapters of the books didn't alter that much over the years. Starts off with a discussion of what you can do with a telescope, and then it takes the subjects of the solar system in turn, and the last chapters are dealing with the fixed stars and clusters and stars and nebulae. So at this point in astronomical history, deep sky objects get very little mention. They're just dim, fuzzy things that don't change. And they're nowhere near as interesting as things like comets and shooting stars. So here now are some illustrations from Mary's book. So these have been designed from the author's own drawings, carefully made from actual heavenly bodies during several years past, she tells us. The telescope employed was made by Dolland, and it was a 2-inch aperture refractor. In some cases, a thing called a day eyepiece was used. So this is an eyepiece with an extra lens in it to turn the image the right way up. But in most cases, a night eyepiece was used. And so you can see here on the left images of the planet Jupiter with its satellites doing their nightly dance either side of the planet. And if you've ever looked through a telescope and seen Jupiter, you'll instantly recognize these. It's obviously done not only from real life, but very accurately done too. And on the right, we see her images of the planet Saturn. In the lower half, progression of images through the years 1848 down to 1858, and indeed the first image shows planet Saturn with an edgewise presentation of its rings, so would have been invisible to her in a telescope at the time. Moving on to her images of the moon, and I find the one on the left particularly interesting in that it's been described as coloured and shaded from actual observation. The sketch was made based on a paper photograph of the moon kindly obtained by a friend. The Countess of Ross was known to be a photographer, and so I wonder if somehow they managed to use the Leviathan or one of the other telescopes that the Earl had at the time to take a picture, a photograph of the moon, and then to sketch in the details on the top of that. So this would have been, again, in the 1850s, really quite early for astronomical photography. And on the right here, again, we see more detailed views of the moon's surface, and again, they're just exactly how they appear through the telescope. Moving on to the sun, Mary gives us various images of the sun in her book, a general image of the sun showing a group of sunspots, and then close-up images of various sunspots, and then finally, again, a progression of images showing how sunspots move across the surface of the sun, seen from the Earth. This is the images from her chapter on eclipses. So we have a partial eclipse of the moon there in February 1858, and it's followed by a rather interesting eclipse a fortnight later in March 1858, which was a total solar eclipse over the United Kingdom. However, from Ireland, as you can see there in the centre image, it was only a very deep partial. And the interest in this eclipse is that they didn't know, using 19th century mathematics, whether it was going to be an annular eclipse or a total eclipse. Photography wasn't sufficiently advanced at this time to be able to take very quick pictures. And the Astronomer Royal of the time recommended that photography be used in the partial phases, but when totality was imminent, you would switch to human observing to decide whether it was partial, annular, or total. Here are her images of the inferior planets, so that's Mercury and Venus, and at the bottom there Mars, and on the right a really quite beautiful rendition of a shooting star. And as you can see, I've put a highlight ring around one of her images of Venus. And it's this one, which Mary tells us that she set up her telescope where passers-by could have a look through it. And several of them invariably thought that the glass of the instrument were either removed or useless. And in fact, they were looking through an empty tube at the moon. But of course they weren't. It was a daylight observation of Venus. Oh, sorry, well, just go back one if I can. Oh, sorry. So she gives us the date, the 24th of January there, 1854. And so we can do a bit of historical digging on this. And there we can see what the sky would have looked like on the day that she gives us. And you can see that Venus, just after sunset there, would have been low in the southwest. So it's a proof that what she's telling us in the book did actually happen. Going on through the book, we come to the 10th chapter, and this marks a dramatic change in style in the book, in that there were some quite spectacular comets in the mid-19th century, and the chapter on comets deals just with them. The first one was in 1854. The comet doesn't have a name, but it's just known as the Great Comet, and perhaps the one you have heard of in 1858 was Donati's comet. So maybe that when Donati's comet came round and she observed it, maybe that was the spur for her to write the book. It was discovered on the 29th of March 1854, and Mary got to hear about it very quickly and made her first observation of it on April 3rd, so just 4 or 5 days after the initial discovery. So Mary gives us a chart of the comet through the night sky and gives us some idea of how big the tail was on each of the various dates. But looking at the background of this chart, we can see that the constellation lines are quite sort of freely drawn and curved, which is a bit unusual for us. We're used to square lines, but of course in these days the boundaries between constellations weren't really fixed, and you could just draw the lines wherever you felt. And so you can see the comet starts off very small with a small tail over on the right, and then as it moves towards the left, it gets better and better. And I've highlighted here the dates when it was closest to the sun, that is perihelion, and indeed closest to the Earth, which is called perigee. So perihelion occurred at a distance of around 0.6 AU, and closest to the Earth at perigee was around 0.55 astronomical units. So this really would have been a spectacular comet. And indeed, it was sufficiently bright that it was the first comet to be photographed on September the 27th by a portrait photographer working at Bolton on the Hill in Surrey. And he managed to capture it with a 7-second exposure, working with an f2.4 portrait lens. We've got all this detail about it, but the photograph apparently hasn't survived. So having said that Mary wrote a book on astronomy, this is perhaps some of the other material that she would have been able to access. There were quite a few magazines of science in the late 19th century, and I've given a list here and the dates in which they were published. Perhaps the best known is the English Mechanic and World of Science, which was a general engineering and scientific magazine, but it did contain reports of RAS meetings and articles on how to build telescopes and what to see with them. And it is in fact in the summer of 1890 that a correspondence between 2 or 3 astronomers starts in the English Mechanic, and that's taken as being the very start of the British Astronomical Association, which started in October 1890. So the bulk of these, I say, were general, but the last one there, the Astronomical Register, was purely astronomy. And it ran from, as you can see, 1862 to 1886. It was similar in nature to the Journal of the British Astronomical Association. So it was amateur astronomers reporting observations and being given lists of objects to observe. But rather surprisingly, it was written, printed and distributed by just one chap living in North London. And then when he got too old to publish, he handed the magazine on to another chap, and he carried on his own. So to produce a magazine, I don't know, 20 or 30 pages a time, once a month, every month for years on end, would have been quite an undertaking. So as you can see, one of them was called Recreative Science. So doing science to fill your spare hours, as it were. And Mary made 2 contributions to this magazine. In January 1860, she submitted a 2-page article on the conjunction of the planet Jupiter and Venus, and that had occurred on the 21st of July 1859. So she's talking about an event that's already happened and her observations of it. And then in the following month, February 1860, she produced a 4-page article on the lunar eclipse of February the 7th, 1860. So again, an event that she's observed and she writes about it. The Mary Ward's publishers, which are a company called Groombridge and Sons, couldn't really make much of a go of the previous magazine. It ran for, I think, about a year and then faded out. But they relaunched it under this title, The Intellectual Observer. And so Mary produced several articles for this. In 1861, she was talking about the transit of Mercury. In 1863, there's a mention of her telescope book. And right down to 1867, there are observations of a transit of Mercury. So looking now at the transit of Mercury observations, so this was November 1861. The transit was due to take place early in the morning, and perhaps the view in the top left here would be familiar to some of us. The disk of the sun, Mercury is in the top left-hand corner, and there are also some out-of-focus tree branches managing to get into the view. So she's looking at it while the planet is still quite low elevation, as early as possible in the morning. So this transit started at 20 past 5 in the morning. Mid-transit was around 20 past 7, and it ended at around 20 past 9. And so Mary observed this with, again, a 2-inch aperture refractor. And then we have more observations of it at the top left there. And then she's showing in the bottom left corner here how you would set up the telescope to make the observation, projecting the image onto a card. And it was said that in this article that Mary was looking forward to the next transit, which would have occurred in November 1868. Here's her observation of another comet. This came round in 1862, and it's now known as Comet Swift-Tuttle. And carrying on the model that she used last time, she's produced a diagram of it, again, moving across the night sky. I'm reasonably happy with the diagram bottom left, but the one at top right, it seems to have got a bit of a kink in the line that the comet's taking across the sky. Not sure it's been that accurately drawn. And so also in this magazine, she discusses the aurora, the November shooting stars, and Jupiter without satellites. So there's quite a broad range of astronomical observations there. But these are just sort of notes about what she's seen, and there aren't any images to go with them. So coming now to the end of the talk, as it were, you can imagine, say, Mary producing a child for her husband virtually every year, extremely tiring. And in 1867, Lord Ross himself became seriously ill and moved to Dublin for medical treatment. Mary, although she was herself pregnant, went to care for Lord Ross. After he died, Mary had now produced a baby. The child was unfortunately ill from a young age, and so she went from caring for an old man to caring for a child, taking even more of her energy. In 1868, she went to Bangor in North Wales for a holiday to hopefully repair her own health. She was complaining of faintness, cough, and giddy spells. And in the following year, bronchitis was diagnosed. But of course, she's living in quite a straitened financial situation. And so she's really got no way out of her problems. So she decided to take a break at Birr Castle with Lady Ross and her family. And one afternoon, they get out the novelty of the family, which is a steam-powered car. And again, built by one of the Rosses, just because they can build a steam engine and build a car and put them together and go for rides around on the village. So here's a map of Parsonstown, as it was then called. The castle is at the bottom, and the telescope, the Leviathan of Parsonstown, is over on the left. And they were going along Oxmanton Mall at an easy pace, which is said to be between 3.5 and 4 miles an hour. Perhaps rather surprisingly, the 15-year-old Charles Parsons was driving, and the family teacher, a chap called Richard Biggs, was said to be guiding the vehicle. And as the car turned the corner from Oxmanton Mall onto the main road, the car gave a lurch, and Mary, who was sitting on the car, was pitched forward and was, I'm afraid to say, almost immediately run over by the vehicle. And the local Kings County Chronicle newspaper reported the utmost gloom pervades the town, and on every hand sympathy is expressed with the husband and family of the accomplished and talented lady who has been so permanently hurried into eternity. The untoward occurrence will plunge several noble families into grief. The death was investigated at a coroner's court with John Corcoran, coroner, holding the inquest. Without retiring, the jury gave their verdict that the deceased had come to her death by an accident fall from the steam car on which he had been riding in the town of Parsonstown on the preceding day. The jury begged to express their sympathy to the Honourable Captain Ward, Hackney's sad bereavement, and also that there was no blame attaching to any person in connection with the occurrence. It's perhaps surprising to find that Mary Ward was laid to rest in the Parsons family vault, not in the family grave of the Ward family. And I'd just like to say that Mary Ross was a consummate photographer, and indeed many of the photographs that we have of the big telescope come from her, not only her camera, but her work in the darkroom as well. And perhaps it's a bit surprising that there are no photographs of this steam car, and indeed no other records of it seem to exist. And it's almost as if the family, in their grief that they've one of their family has been killed by this car, that they destroy all the car and all the records and all the photographs. But as I said earlier, there was a magazine for amateur astronomers at this time, the Astronomical Register, and Mary's obituary appears in there. And it starts off, we have to record the loss of a distinguished labourer in the field of astronomy, the Honourable Mrs. Mary Ward, the author of telescope teachings and various other writings of high scientific interest, is no more. He does go on at length describing her work not only in astronomy but in other scientific fields. So to summarise, Mary Ward was born in 1827 in County Offaly in Ireland. She married in 1854 to Henry Ward, and she died on the 31st of August 1869 at Parsonstown. And she's known as a naturalist, astronomer, microscopist, author and artist. And her name does crop up reasonably often in pub quizzes as the first person to die in a motor car accident. So I'll just finish with an image of Mary here, and indeed one of her images of her estate painted by herself. And I'll take any questions.
Well, thank you ever so much, Bill. That was wonderful. I'm sure we will have some questions. I have a confession to make. I'm awful grateful to you for allowing us to record, because having eagerly anticipated this talk, just as you got to the end there, was it August 1869 when the accident occurred? I think you said.
Yes.
You put up the map of the village, and at that point my doorbell rang. And the lady next door came round and was asking me whether we could look after her dog on Saturday. And she went on and on and on. And we're already dog sitting to another dog. So I was out for about 3 or 4 minutes. And when I came back, Mary Ward was already dead. Yeah. And I missed the whole thing. So I still don't know what happened. But don't worry, I'm not asking you to rerun it. At least we've got a recording, and I can find out. I don't want a spoiler, but I actually missed the important bit about what happened. I got as far as the map, and that was it. Oh well, there we are. Some of the advantages and disadvantages of doing Zooms from home, I suppose. Yeah. Wow. Well, I think first we're going to have. Well, I'll hand over to everybody for questions, but before I do that, as if it were live, as it were, face to face, the first thing we'd do is give you a resounding round of applause. So I think everybody, round of applause, show it on your whatever, but it usually tends to be a bit silent, but thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
There you go. That was wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, I mean I've heard of her, I think, but that's about all. But what a wonderful art! Those pictures were wonderful, weren't they?
Hmm.
It's quite ironic. I showed you that ephemeris of Comet K2 coming up, and it's all a bit bland and a bit boring and computer generated. But her pictures were wonderful, weren't they? They really are splendid, and I particularly like the pictures of Saturn and Jupiter. But there we are. Right. Has someone got a question? I'm sure they have. I'll hand it over to you.
Yes, I have.
Go
Did
ahead,
she
Sue.
ever, did she ever look at Mars and sort of see anything on Mars, or she doesn't appear to have done? But I wondered if you knew, Bill, whether she had, done that particular.
So yeah, in her book, there are rather small images of Mars. The telescope that she used to write the book, and she seems to have used most of the time, was only a 2-inch refractor, which is probably a bit small to look at Mars. Obviously, there was the Leviathan, the really big telescope at Parsonstown. But as you can probably notice from the photograph I showed, it's sung between 2 masonry walls. And so you get about an hour's worth of observation of any particular object, and then you have to wait for another object to drift into view. And to go sort of right off the subject at this point, at this point in history, it was kind of the last time when religion is taken seriously scientifically. And the idea is that if you could show that the deep sky never changed, that would be a tick in the box for God being the creator. But if you could show change in the deep sky, then that would be a tick against God, as it were. And of course, if you use a small telescope, you see some nebulous objects and star clusters. And with a bigger telescope, you see some of the nebulous objects resolve into stars. And so the idea was, if you built a really big telescope, then maybe all the nebulae would turn out just to be star clusters, and there wouldn't be any nebulae at all. So that's kind of maybe one of the reasons that the big telescope was built. But there were others around on the estate. Obviously, you don't just go into building a 6-foot aperture telescope on the spur of the moment. There were smaller ones building up in size. But so to actually answer your question, no, there are no serious, shall we say, Mars observations by this astronomer.
You mentioned that one of the journals, she was only one of 3 women to get a copy. Was that the society or whoever the organisation was publishing that being very staid in their ways and limiting it, or was that more there were only 3 women interested? So yes, the 3 ladies received monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society. The RAS started in 1820 as the Astronomical Society of London and gained their royal charter in 1837 from King William IV. But their charter referred to fellows rather than members, and always used a male pronoun. And so even down to 1915, it was still a male-only organisation. Because by the time we get into the early 20th century, we get the suffragette movement and emancipation of women across all fields of science and society. And the RAS hid behind this clause that said that the fellows were always referred to as either he or him. But as time went on, it was seen to be a
rather poor excuse, a supplemental charter was granted, and then the first female fellows joined the RAS in January 1916, which is another subject that I've written on, presented on in the past. And of course, there were attempts to employ ladies at Greenwich Observatory, but these didn't really work very well. Ladies couldn't get a university education. You could be as interested in any subject as you like, but you couldn't, progress in it or use it to derive an income. And that's just how things were back then. It was a male-dominated society. And so, yes, 3 ladies receiving the monthly notices of the RAS was what actually happened. I think it was in 1862 that Mary Ward actually managed to get to go inside Greenwich Observatory after quite a long campaign, both by herself and several prominent male astronomers. But even then, it was just a go in the door and look at the instruments and come out again.
Don't touch. Yeah.
Bill, that was absolutely. Oh, sorry, Chris. Bill, that was absolutely fascinating. One of the things I thought was beautiful was the drawings that she did. So, who was she trained to do that, or was she just naturally gifted as an artist? Because they are beautiful.
I don't know. I imagine the family would have had a governess, and of course, at this point in history, there's no television, no radio, no internet. You would have had awful lot of time to practice doing things, and of course, buying a paintbrush and paints would have been relatively easy. I really should have looked before I started to talk. You can still buy copies of her book on a second-hand book market. Rather surprisingly, some of the covers of her books actually have a floral decoration on them, which is nothing to do with astronomy. It does suggest that the publisher had the text of the book in one hand and some covers in the other, and just united them and pushed the book out there. There are internet sites where you can buy second-hand books of all sorts, and so you look on there and you decide whether you can afford the book or not, whether you think it's a reasonable price. But quite often, buying a second-hand scientific book is only the start, because previous owners will have put either just their name or would have written notes in the book. So you can then spend days or weeks researching, trying to find out who these people
are. Thank you.
Yeah, despite the absence of all those aforementioned modern attractions and conveniences, even so, given the family that you outlined to us, we all know what she spent most of her time clearly making babies, giving birth, and looking after babies, and yet more babies. I'm still astonished she found the time to do anything. But yeah, she's an amazing woman, really. Fantastic.
And of course, healthcare at this time wasn't particularly good either. You could be perfectly healthy, even in mid-age, young adulthood, and you could be dead in a fortnight.
Suddenly,
you could catch a viral disease that there was no treatment for, and be be dispatched in very short order. And of course, women face not only the threat of disease, but also the very real risk of dying in childbirth.
Absolutely. And in her case, what, 8, 9, 10-fold? Amazing. It's amazing she got that far, really. But
yes.
But yeah, I agree with Sarah. Those drawings are absolutely magnificent, superb. Anybody else?
Was her books widely published? I mean, do we know how many copies were made?
The short answer is no.
Difficult to determine.
It obviously ran through, as I say, 6 editions, and shortly before her death, her publisher said, "Well, we'll put the book out again in another edition," and she said, "No, it's been out too long. It needs a thorough overhaul," which apparently she was going to embark on had she not died. So yes, it was published in many editions, which again perhaps points to its popularity. There are an awful lot of astronomy books that come out in the first edition and then never get reissued.
Yeah.
Those are the unpopular ones. And then you get things like Norton Star Atlas, which I don't know, ran through about 20 editions over the years. So yes, I imagine they would have been produced in quite large numbers.
Anyone else? I've got one more. Just going back to the Leviathan, Bill. I noted you'd already answered the question I was going to ask about the ability to track because of those 2 masonry walls, as you say. It's effectively a transit scope, isn't it? The object comes to it rather than it chasing the object. But I seem to remember, I don't know whether it's the same scope, the same site, Burghcastle, but I'm sure I've seen sketches or maybe even a photograph of another Leviathan in Ireland, possibly at Burghcastle, which was on a giant circle of wheels, which could rotate in azimuth, and didn't have those walls. Were those walls knocked down later, and was that then developed into a more mobile scope, or have I got that wrong? Do you know?
So no, the masonry walls still exist, and the telescope tube still exists. And a few years ago now, a replacement mirror was installed, and it was actually used again for a few years. I say that there were other instruments around, and I think it's the 4th Earl of Ross who gets extremely interested in the surface temperature of the moon, to the extent that he manages to build a thermocouple and put it at the focus again of another telescope, which I think was a 36-inch reflector. And he came up with an answer which was widely derided at the time as being far too high. And it was only in the 1960s when astronauts went to the moon and kind of put the thermometer down on the surface. And he was right to within about 10%, I think.
Okay.
But another large altazimuth on wheels is kind of suggesting the William Herschel telescope.
Okay. No, I just thought it was in Ireland somewhere, but I've probably got that wrong. But okay, interesting.
I also wondered whether she ever went to the Armagh Observatory, which in Ireland, from where she was. Did she ever? You haven't heard whether she visited them. It was it's quite an old observatory, and I thought, maybe she. I don't know if there's anything in any book about her visiting there or anything.
Not that I know of, but the fact that she received publications of the RAS was apparently at the agitation of the Astronomer Royal for Ireland, Thomas Ramsay Robinson, and I think that's the observatory that he was at. That was kind of the Greenwich of Ireland. So it's possible that she went there. Yes, if he was agitating for her to receive publications of the RAS, he must have known her and known her abilities. So they may well have known each other on a personal basis as well.
Mm.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Okay. If we're done, we're done. But anybody else? I think we're done. Well, thank you ever so much, Bill. That was fantastic, really. And I will find out what happened to her when I look at the recording. But there we are. But I really appreciate you coming along and doing this for us. To wrap up our season, actually, this is our last one. But I noticed on your, I can't remember now, your website, or you sent me an email, you've got some other subjects, which mainly on an astronomical topic. And we always have at least one astronomical talk per season. So I'm sure we'll be back in touch with you to maybe do another one for us. If not next season, certainly the season after, probably in the not too distant future anyway. For your information, we're still continuing with Zooms. We're going to talk in August about what we do going forward, but the Zooms seem to work. Some people want us to meet in face-to-face. Some people prefer the Zooms, but it's all a matter of cost and stuff as well. And I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we've got to discuss subs for next year, but don't get too concerned. I don't think they're going to go up by 30% or something ridiculous, but we'll look at that. But they're the kind of things we've got to consider about costs and things, because as we all know, everything's going through the roof at the moment. So, but once again, thank you ever so much. I'll stop the recording, and we hope to invite you back again soon, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
So if I might just